Okay.
It'll take over once it drains all the way down. So, is that good?
Okay. Ready?
I
Alright.
guess I'm ready.
The first question I have for you.
Don't talk so much, I said. You said.
What was it like to grow up with a father who had a television show?
Well, he was in the public eye and people knew him. So when we would go out to places, particularly to churches, people would regularly come up to him and say hello, and oftentimes he couldn't remember everybody's name, so he used to tell me that oh, that's Mom. Anyway, so it was interesting. I mean, he wasn't like overwhelmingly famous, but he was well known around Chicago, particularly in the church-going gospel community. So that was interesting. And when we'd go to churches, oftentimes, since he wasn't just the host of this television show, he was also very involved in the civil rights movement and other type of labor rights movements, as well as electoral politics. So they would, when we'd go to a church, it was very common for the pastor to say, "Now we'd like to hear from Brother Sid." So that was a rather unique experience, especially as a white young Jewish boy. So.
Okay. How did growing up with two older sisters shape you to be who you are today?
Well, I think that it allowed me to get established early on, like what it's like to have women in your life, which I think is helpful. I'm going to explore that part of, my personality, that perspective is really important. And I learned about, all the social conditioning that young girls and then women go through in terms of how they're to present themselves to the world and all that. And also, how just kind of how they navigated in the world and how they, what was important to them and not important to them, as opposed to from my perspective and those of my male friends when I was growing up. So that, I got a bit of insight. However, that pales in comparison to having a daughter. So that just took it up many notches in terms of my understanding of the female experience.
Okay.
Excellent. This is going along really well. Let me just see. Sorry, I just want to make sure that this isn't an emergency. Okay, great.
Okay. What was it like going to a Chicago public school and being one of the only white kids?
Well, I wouldn't say I wasn't one of the only white kids, although I went to race school for grade school, and it was pretty mixed, although I'd say maybe it was like around 50-50 in terms of black people versus white people. I'm not exactly sure, but I think at Kenwood, my high school, I think white people were a minority. What was that like? I mean, honestly, when I was in it, I didn't even think twice about it. It didn't occur to me, like, this is not normal. I honestly never really thought about it. It's kind of like the experience when Eli, your brother, was playing on this team when we lived in the Humboldt Park area. And it wasn't until the last day when I recognized, like, oh, he's the only non-Latino boy on the team. When it was the last day, I'm like, oh. Not that I don't see, I find culture and ethnic background really fascinating, but I think that it broadened my horizons. Looking back on it as an adult, I think it really allowed me to accept people for who they are in a much more natural way, to be honest with you. I think that has a lot to do with how I, move through the world in terms of interacting with folks and just genuinely interested in different cultures and trying different foods and just different ethnic backgrounds. And it's always been really interesting to me. And growing up, like, I used to go to these parties when I was in high school, house music parties, and I was regularly, if not one of the only white people there. Oftentimes I was the only white person there, and I would like go there and dance all night with my buddies, and we had a great time. I just think that there's a power in being comfortable being a minority, and it's a grounding experience, and it also it helps you maintain a good sense of humility in all the right ways. Not being humble like you're not proud of who you are, but just a sense of humility in terms of not being braggadocious or ostentatious in the way you move through the world. So.
Okay. How did growing up in a Jewish household shape you to be who you are today?
Well, that's an interesting question because my upbringing was rather perfunctory in terms of my Jewish experience. Perfunctory kind of means like you're just going through the motions. You're not really emotionally invested in it. And I never really felt all that. I never had a real close relationship to my Jewish identity or to being involved in the synagogue or anything like that. I really was not. I mean, I kind of had an issue with some of the other Jewish kids in there in terms of their like disrespect to the rabbi. It was appalling, actually. But growing up in a Jewish household, I think that my mother and father had certain ideals. They didn't express them as Jewish ideals per se. I think that they just naturally had them from their parents in terms of honoring people. My mother always was very clear not to hate. The concept of social justice, which is very prevalent in Jewish culture, my father was very into that and standing up for people who didn't have much of a voice, powerfully in a lot of ways. But also there's a lot of, in the Jewish culture, debate and really animated conversation and debate over issues is something that I loved in our home. I loved talking to my father and mother and challenging them on issues. They're not challenging to challenge for sake. I was just curious. And so the conversations we'd have around the dinner table were priceless. I mean, I could ask my father and say, well, what are your thoughts about, the difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? And he would give me a thoughtful answer, and he'd come back. And he would never dictate to me how to think at all, and neither did my mother. But they were both like, my friends loved my parents. And I think, I don't know how much they embraced their Jewish identity, but I think that the Jewish culture moved through them in terms of our desire to have thoughtful conversations about whatever the topic of the day is. And I really love that and appreciate that in a big way. So, and also like now, I'm actually way more aware of my Jewish identity now that I have children, and also particularly what's happening in Israel. I mean, it's very, very concerning, and I could go on and on about that, but that would be a whole nother interview. But that's really, really important to me in terms of looking at the totality of what's happening and not having some knee-jerk reactions, which is what my parents taught me to do. So.
All right, that's it.
Great. All right, that's
a lot quicker.
Is that a wrap?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a wrap, guys. And scene.